Where do you see the nexus between health, security and climate change, and what's your interest in this conference today?
Policy failure on climate change is going to put enormous pressure on both the military and the health communities, because in effect they'll be our first responders to the consequences of failing to address climate change. Anybody who thinks that a world that's 2 or 4 degrees hotter will be healthy or secure is kidding themselves. They haven't actually understood what climate change means.
And what's come out of the conference for you today? What do you see as the next steps?
Well, what I think has been interesting for me, and I was only able to be here for part of it, was the focus really on getting the policy and politics right, and the extent to which all through the conference, not just in the section devoted to that, there was a real interest in let's get on with it. Let's get and do things. Let's not, keep sort of worrying about it. And I thought one of the very good things that came out was the sort of sense in which, the climate deniers are the enemy, and which in a sense is true. They are. I mean, there is no analytical basis for it. I would be more comfortable with them if they just came out honestly and said that they are, it's just a political view they have, instead of trying to argue about their science, which they don't know very much about, and which just confuses the issue. It slows things down. It doesn't actually help us get on with dealing with something that will affect the well-being, the livelihood of every single person on the planet.
And you've touched on the politics there and the importance of doing something. Where do you see the prospects for and the opportunities for progress on getting political action on climate change?
Well, one of the things that's important about this conference, in a sense, is the way in which it's starting to move the debate outside the ranks of the climate scientists and the climate policy professionals into wider communities. At the end of the day, we know what we have to do on climate change. We have to get to a carbon neutral global energy system by around the middle of the century. We know we can do that. We have the technology, the engineering skills already to do that. We know we can afford to do it. The IEA made a good estimate a couple of years ago that it might cost us a couple of £1 trillion more than we're going to have to invest anyway to meet the energy needs of a growing population. Well, a couple of trillion, that's, a few tens of billions a year. That's small change if you're a banker. It's really affordable. So we know all that. What we don't know is how to put the political will together to deploy those technologies, to make that capital work for the transition to a low carbon economy. And to generate that political will, you really do need to make this a conversation that involves all kinds of communities, not just the sort of specialist communities. So this conference was a kind of important and useful step in widening that range of people involved in the conversation.
And to bring it back to the kind of specialist community, the UN climate talks are coming up towards the end of the year. Is that an avenue that you see kind of bearing fruit at all?
Yes, but the question is when. If you don't have a global agreement on climate change, a legally binding global agreement on climate change, you don't have a solution to the problem. But that agreement is the outcome of political processes. It's not an input to them. So it's very important to see the negotiations as part of a much broader political process, most of the conversations of which go on in capitals, which is exactly where the communities involved today are most engaged. The health community, the defence community, it's what they're saying in their capitals that matters. If we get more of that, then you create more room in the negotiations to make real progress. Now, anybody who thinks that we're going to somehow deal with what has, without a doubt, the most difficult problem humanity has ever faced, that somehow we're going to be able to deal with that faster than we dealt with the trade talks or the strategic arms talks, both of which took 5 decades to reach even partial solutions. You're kidding yourself about how you're setting the wrong expectations. There's a whole sort of tendency in the media to see every single meeting of the UN Framework Convention as if it were the cup final. And if you don't have a winner, somehow the whole thing is stupid. And that is just a very silly way to think about how you really make international processes work.
And how do you see things panning out in the next 10, 15 years in terms of the trends that you've been observing in public reaction to climate change and also attitudes towards it amongst politicians and policymakers?
Events are going to drive this forward. Anybody who bets that somehow the world's governments aren't going to react and do something about this issue I think is making a pretty weak bet, simply because events will happen. There will be more extreme weather events. There will be more knowledge coming through, not now about how the climate works so much, but about what the impacts of that on human beings' lives will be. I think that's going to drive governments to respond. The issue is whether they respond smartly or stupidly, and whether they respond quickly or slowly. The slower they respond, the more likely they are to do stupid things, and that will certainly be more expensive and maybe even counterproductive. So the earlier we can get governments to sort of restore the political momentum into addressing the problem, the better. Now, actually, almost everything that you would want to do to decarbonize your economy, get your economies off the oil hook, would actually right now help to get exactly the growth that politicians are around praying for, without much success, I may say.
Okay, thank you much for joining us. It's been really interesting to talk to you.
Pleasure.